You could say my life had been one long, uninterrupted hum of predictability. Suburban houses all painted different shades of beige, driveways lined with SUVs that hadn't seen adventure in years, and the soft chorus of sprinklers at dusk. My days moved to the rhythm of laundry cycles and my husband Ben's late-night work calls. Dependable, stable, and about as exciting as boiled potatoes. Ben and I had been together for over a decade, and if love had seasons, ours had settled into a gray, endless winter. Don't get me wrong, he wasn't a bad man. He paid the bills, remembered birthdays, and always fixed the leaky faucets without being asked. But somewhere along the way, the little things, shared laughs, whispered dreams, stolen touches had vanished, replaced by an unspoken understanding that we'd simply coexist. Then came the summer when everything shifted. The heat pressed down on the neighborhood like a heavy hand, forcing us all into slow motion. It was during one of those sticky afternoons, as I hung laundry in the backyard, that I noticed him. Ryan was 19, young enough to be the kid next door, but with a confidence that suggested he knew more about the world than he should. He worked odd jobs around the neighborhood, mowing lawns, fixing fences, and charming every grandmother within a 2-mile radius. I'd seen him before, of course, but never really looked at him. Not until that day. He was shirtless, the sun carving shadows across the lean lines of his chest as he worked on Mrs. Harlan's broken swing next door. His laughter floated over the fence, easy and unburdened. When his gaze caught mine, it wasn't the quick, dismissive glance of a teenager. It lingered, and for the first time in years, I felt seen. I tried to shake it off, chalking up the strange flutter in my chest to the heat. But over the next few weeks, I couldn't ignore it. The way he smiled when he passed me, the way his voice dropped an octave when he said my name, Olivia, as if he were trying it on for size. It was intoxicating and terrifying to feel so alive in his presence. Then one evening, as I trimmed the overgrown hedge along our driveway, he appeared. "You've got a stubborn one there," he said, leaning casually on the fence, sweat glistening on his skin. His grin was all confidence, no hesitation. "Story of my life," I muttered, trying to sound disinterested, though my hands trembled around the shears. "Want a hand?" he asked, stepping closer. His tone wasn't innocent, and neither was the look in his eyes. I should have said no. I should have laughed it off and walked inside. But I didn't. I let him hold the shears, let his fingers brush mine as he took them from me. The electricity in that small touch shot through me like a jolt. I was no longer the woman hanging laundry. I was someone else, someone dangerous, reckless, and terrifyingly alive. I told myself it was nothing, a fleeting moment of harmless attention. But deep down, I knew that wasn't true. Something had shifted. My carefully constructed routine had cracked, and through the gap, the kind of emotions I thought I'd buried began clawing their way back to the surface. It wasn't just Ryan's looks, though there was no denying his presence was magnetic. It was the way he made me feel like I mattered. His casual compliments landed with the weight of long-forgotten whispers. And for someone like me, trapped in a life of bland reliability, it was a drug I didn't want to admit I craved. The exchanges became regular. I'd see him out front, mowing Mrs. Harlan's lawn or fiddling with his truck, and he'd always call out to me, "Hey, Olivia, need help with that?" Or, "Looking good today." Innocent enough, yet charged with something neither of us dared name. One afternoon, as I stood watering the hydrangeas that refused to bloom, he appeared again. This time, he leaned against the fence, his grin wider than usual. "You ever take a break?" he asked, tilting his head like he was genuinely curious. "Breaks don't water plants," I said, attempting to sound breezy. His eyes lingered on mine, a quiet challenge sparking in his gaze. "Maybe you just need someone else to do it for you." The words hung between us, heavy and full of meaning. My throat tightened, and for a second I thought about walking inside, ending this little game before it spiraled out of control. But I didn't. Instead, I smiled, a small, uncertain curve of my lips that felt like opening a door just wide enough for trouble to slip through. The next day, I found a reason to be outside longer than usual. The garden, which had already been neat, suddenly needed extra attention. I was pruning the rose bushes when I heard footsteps. Turning, I found Ryan walking toward me with his easy, confident stride. "Got any lemonade?" he asked, fanning himself dramatically with his baseball cap. I laughed, more out of nerves than humor. "I might be able to find some." The kitchen felt stifling with him so close, his broad shoulders brushing the edge of the counter as I poured 2 glasses. He leaned casually against the fridge, his gaze fixed on me like I was the only thing worth seeing. "You've got a nice place," he said, his voice low and deliberate. "Cozy." "Thanks," I replied, handing him the glass. My fingers grazed his, and I felt it again, that spark, the one I couldn't ignore. We sipped our lemonade in silence for a moment, the kind that felt more charged than any conversation. I could hear the faint hum of the fridge, the steady ticking of the clock, but all my senses were on him. The way his lips curved around the rim of the glass. The way his eyes never left mine. "Your husband works late, doesn't he?" he asked, breaking the silence. I froze for half a second, his question slicing through the bubble of warmth like a cold wind. "Yes," I said finally, my voice quieter. "He does." Ryan set his glass down, stepping closer, close enough that I could smell the faint trace of cologne mingling with the salt of his sweat. "Must get lonely," he said, his tone softer now, almost sympathetic. I should have told him to leave. I should have walked him to the door, forced a polite smile, and closed this chapter before it even began. But instead, I stood there, letting the weight of his words settle into the cracks of my life. Sometimes, I admit it, the word barely a whisper. His hand brushed mine, deliberate and slow, and my breath hitched. He tilted his head slightly, his lips parting as if he was about to say something else. But he didn't. Instead, he turned, picking up his glass and draining it in one long sip. "Thanks for the lemonade," he said, his grin returning. "I'll see you around, Olivia." And just like that, he was gone, leaving me standing in the kitchen, my heart pounding so hard it felt like it might break free from my chest. I told myself it was over, that I'd never let it happen again. But the truth was, I couldn't stop replaying it in my mind. The way he'd looked at me, the way he'd touched my hand. It wasn't much, but it was enough to remind me what it felt like to be noticed. And I wasn't ready to give that up. The first time it happened, it felt like an out-of-body experience. As if I were watching someone else's life unfold, someone reckless and impulsive. Certainly not me. But it was me. And there was no one doing it. It began with another ordinary evening. Ben was working late again, buried in spreadsheets and endless emails. The house was quiet except for the hum of the dishwasher and the occasional creak of floorboards beneath my restless pacing. I had just sat down with a glass of wine when a knock at the door startled me. When I opened it, there he was. Ryan. His hair was damp, as if he'd just showered, and he wore a loose-fitting t-shirt that clung to his frame in all the right places. "Hey," he said, flashing that crooked grin that made my pulse quicken. "Hope I'm not bothering you." I hesitated, my hand gripping the edge of the door. "No, not at all. I noticed your porch light's out. Thought I'd come by and fix it." "It's dark out there," he added, his voice dripping with an almost innocent concern that belied the spark in his eyes. "You didn't have to do that," I said, though I didn't step aside to stop him. "I don't mind," he replied, stepping past me into the dimly lit hallway. He worked quickly, climbing the ladder he'd brought with him to unscrew the burnt-out bulb. I stood nearby, pretending to busy myself with tidying a shelf, but my focus was entirely on him, The way his muscles shifted beneath his shirt, the easy confidence in his movements. "All done," he said, hopping down from the ladder with a satisfied grin. "Thank you," I murmured, my voice quieter than I intended. "No problem." He glanced around, his eyes lingering on the glass of wine on the counter. "Celebrating something?" I shook my head, a nervous laugh escaping before I could stop it. "No, just winding down." His gaze softened, and he leaned against the counter, so close I could feel the warmth radiating off him. "You deserve that," he said, his voice low. "Winding down. Relaxing. You do so much." It was such a simple thing to say, but it broke something inside me. A crack that had been forming for years finally gave way. "Ryan," I started, though I didn't know what I was going to say. But he stepped closer, his hand brushing mine. "Olivia," he said, his tone gentle but insistent, "you don't have to say anything." And then it happened. He kissed me. Soft at first, almost tentative, as if waiting for me to stop him. But I didn't. Instead, I leaned into it, letting the weight of everything I'd been holding in, years of loneliness, yearning, resentment, pour into that kiss. His hands slid to my waist, pulling me closer, and I felt myself melt against him. For the first time in what felt like forever, I wasn't invisible. I was seen, desired. When we finally pulled apart, the reality of what we'd done came crashing down. My chest tightened, and I stepped back, covering my mouth with trembling fingers. This can't happen," I whispered, though the words felt hollow even as I said them. Ryan's gaze never wavered, his expression a mix of understanding and something deeper, something dangerous. "I know," he said softly, "but it already has." We stood there in silence, the air between us thick with everything we couldn't say. "I should go," he said finally, his voice heavy. I nodded, unable to meet his eyes. He walked to the door, pausing for a moment before stepping outside. "Good night, Olivia," he said, his voice tinged with something I couldn't name. And then he was gone, leaving me alone in the quiet house with my racing heart and the weight of what we'd done. That night, I couldn't sleep. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, replaying the kiss over and over. Guilt gnawed at me, but it couldn't smother the flicker of something else, something I was too afraid to name. When Ben came home hours later, he kissed my forehead absently before collapsing into bed, completely unaware of the storm raging inside me. I told myself it was a mistake, that it would never happen again. But deep down, I wasn't sure if I wanted that to be true. The days that followed felt like a delicate balancing act, though I wasn't entirely sure what I was trying to hold together. My marriage, my sanity, or the shaky boundaries I'd already let crumble. Ryan stayed away for the first few days, and I told myself that was good. Necessary. Without him there, it would be easier to forget. But forgetting wasn't as simple as I'd hoped. Every time I stood at the kitchen sink, I saw the spot where he'd leaned against the counter. Every time I opened the front door, I imagined his shadow lingering in the frame. My mind was a slideshow of that kiss, a loop I couldn't pause, no matter how hard I tried. Ben, oblivious to the turmoil, carried on as usual. He spent long hours at work, barely glancing up from his phone when he was home. One evening, I caught myself staring at him across the dinner table, studying the man I'd shared a life with for years. His features were familiar, yet they felt distant, like looking at a photograph of someone you hadn't seen in decades. "You okay?" he asked, not looking up from his plate. "Yeah," I lied, my fork scraping against the porcelain. But I wasn't okay. I was unraveling, and I didn't know how to stop it. The next encounter came when I least expected it. I was folding laundry in the living room, the hum of the dryer providing a steady rhythm to my chaotic thoughts, when there was a knock at the door. My stomach dropped. I knew it was him before I even opened it. Ryan stood there, holding a toolbox and wearing that same easy grin that had undone me the first time. "Mrs. Wilson said her faucet's leaking. Thought I'd borrow your wrench if you've got one." I froze, the pile of laundry forgotten on the couch. "A wrench," I repeated dumbly, as if I'd never heard the word before. "Yeah," he said, his grin softening into something more cautious. "Unless this is a bad time?" "No," I said quickly, stepping aside. "It's fine." He followed me into the kitchen, and the air between us felt heavier with every step. I rummaged through the drawer where Ben kept his tools, acutely aware of how close Ryan stood. His presence was like static electricity, humming beneath my skin. "Here," I said, handing him the wrench without looking at him. But instead of taking it, he let his fingers brush mine. The touch was brief, almost accidental, but it sent a jolt through me that I couldn't ignore. "Olivia," he said, his voice low. "Are you okay?" I turned to face him, his concern written plainly on his face. It was too much, the closeness, the weight of his gaze, the way he said my name like it was something worth holding on to. "I don't know," I admitted, my voice barely above a whisper. He stepped closer, his hand brushing my arm. "I can't stop thinking about you," he said. "About us." "There is no us," I replied, though my resolve was cracking with every passing second. He tilted his head, his eyes searching mine. "You don't believe that." I didn't have a response. Instead, I stood there, caught between the life I knew and the one I was too afraid to imagine. Then, without warning, the sound of a car pulling into the driveway broke the moment. My heart leapt into my throat as I glanced out the window. Ben was home. "Go," I hissed, pushing Ryan toward the back door. He didn't argue. With one last lingering glance, he slipped out into the backyard, disappearing just as Ben stepped inside. "Hey," Ben said, setting his briefcase on the counter. "What's for dinner?" Pasta," I stammered, my hands shaking as I pretended to rearrange the silverware drawer. "Sounds good," he replied, oblivious to the chaos that had just unfolded. That night, as Ben sat beside me on the couch, his focus fixed on the game playing on TV, I felt like I was suffocating. He didn't notice the way my fingers trembled or the glassy look in my eyes. He didn't see the cracks in our foundation widening, threatening to swallow us whole. And maybe that was the worst part. Not the kiss, not the lingering glances, not even the ache of guilt that gnawed at my chest. It was the realization that I could burn the whole house down, and he might not even notice. By the time the weekend arrived, my resolve had eroded to a threadbare sliver. I had spent the last few days ricocheting between guilt and longing, trying to smother thoughts of Ryan, only to have them flare up stronger. Saturday morning was heavy with heat, the kind that made the air feel thick and sluggish. Ben had left early for a work conference, muttering something about catching the afternoon keynote speaker. He'd kissed my cheek before leaving, a quick, absent motion, and the hollowness of it lingered long after he was gone. I busied myself with chores, scrubbing countertops that were already clean and reorganizing drawers that didn't need it. But no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't quiet the restlessness that thrummed beneath my skin. When the knock came at the door that afternoon, I knew before I even opened it. Ryan stood on the porch, hands shoved into his pockets, his hair damp from a recent shower. He didn't grin this time. He didn't say anything at all. He just looked at me with those piercing eyes, and I felt the breath leave my lungs. "Hi," I said, my voice trembling. "Hi," he replied, just as soft. We stood there for a moment, the weight of unspoken words pressing down on both of us. I should have sent him away, closed the door, and walked back inside to pretend none of this had ever happened. But instead, I stepped aside. "Come in," I said. He didn't hesitate, crossing the threshold with quiet confidence. Once the door closed behind him, the air seemed to crackle with something electric, something I couldn't name but couldn't ignore. "What are you doing here?" I asked, though my tone lacked conviction. "I couldn't stay away," he said simply. There was no pretense in his words, no apology for what he wanted. And maybe that's what undid me. The honesty, the rawness of it. I shouldn't, I started, but my voice faltered as he stepped closer. "You don't have to," he said, his voice low and steady. "Not if you don't want to." And that was the moment I stopped fighting. When he kissed me this time, there was no hesitation, no room for doubt. His hands cupped my face, his touch firm but gentle, and I melted into him like I'd been waiting my whole life for this. Every kiss, every caress, felt like a match igniting something deep within me that I hadn't realized was there. We moved together like we were caught in a tide, swept up in something too powerful to resist. He pulled me closer, his hands sliding down my back, and I clung to him, desperate to hold onto this feeling, this fleeting moment where nothing else mattered. "Olivia," he murmured against my lips, his voice thick with emotion. "Tell me this isn't wrong." But I couldn't, because in that moment, with his arms around me and the world fading into nothing, it didn't feel wrong. It felt like breathing after years of holding my breath. Time blurred as we tumbled deeper into the fire we'd started. Every touch, every whispered word, only pulled me further away from the life I'd known and closer to something wild, something untamed. When it was over, we lay tangled together on the living room floor, the sun casting long shadows across the walls. My heart raced as I stared at the ceiling, my mind grappling with what we'd done. Ryan propped himself up on one elbow, his gaze fixed on me. "Are you okay?" he asked, his voice soft. "I don't know," I admitted. But even as the words left my lips, I knew they weren't entirely true. For the first time in years, I felt alive.
Seen.
Wanted. As the afternoon faded into evening, Ryan slipped away, leaving me alone in the quiet house. I sat on the couch, my arms wrapped around my knees, replaying every moment in my mind. Guilt lingered at the edges, a shadow I couldn't fully ignore. But it was drowned out by something else, something far more dangerous. Because even as I told myself it had to stop, I knew it wouldn't. I thought I could bury it, shove the memory of that afternoon into some dark corner of my mind, and pretend it didn't exist. But secrets have a way of clawing their way to the surface, no matter how deeply you try to bury them. Ryan was gone the next day, off to work on another project somewhere across the neighborhood. I told myself it was for the best. Distance was what I needed to get my head straight, to remind myself of the boundaries I had so carelessly demolished. But the space didn't help. If anything, it made things worse. Every silence was a space for my mind to wander, every empty moment an opportunity for the memory of him to take root. I replayed it all, his touch, his words, the way he looked at me like I was something worth risking everything for. Ben came home that evening, tired and distracted as always. He dropped his keys on the counter and poured himself a drink without so much as a glance in my direction. "How was your day?" I asked, trying to sound casual. "Long," he replied, his voice flat. He didn't ask about my day. He never did anymore. We ate dinner in near silence, the clink of silverware on plates the only sound between us. I tried to engage him, asked about his work, his colleagues, but his answers were short, perfunctory. By the time he retreated to his office to finish some last-minute paperwork, I felt like a ghost in my own home. I sat on the couch, staring at the blank television screen, the weight of what I'd done pressing down on me. My chest felt tight, my throat dry. I wanted to cry, to scream, to do anything that might break through the numbness. But I didn't. Instead, I texted Ryan. "Hey." I stared at the screen, my heart pounding as I waited for a reply. It came almost immediately. "Ryan, hey. You okay?" I hesitated before typing back. "Not really." He called within seconds, his voice warm and concerned. "What's wrong?" "I don't know," I admitted, my voice trembling. I don't know how to handle this." "Do you regret it?" he asked, his tone careful, like he was bracing himself for an answer he didn't want to hear. I closed my eyes, taking a shaky breath. "No," I said finally. "That's the problem. I don't regret it." There was silence on the other end of the line, and for a moment, I thought he might hang up. But then he spoke. "Can I see you?" The question hung in the air, heavy and charged. My pulse quickened, and before I could stop myself, I said, "Yes." He came over that night, slipping through the back door like a thief in the dark. I led him to the living room, where the glow of a single lamp cast long shadows across the walls. "I shouldn't be here," he said softly, but his eyes told a different story. "I know," I replied, my voice barely audible. And yet, neither of us moved to stop what was about to happen. This time, there was no hesitation, no pretense of resistance. When he pulled me into his arms, I gave in completely, letting the weight of the world fall away. Every kiss, every touch, was a quiet rebellion against the life I'd been living, the life that had suffocated me for so long. But even in the heat of the moment, the cracks began to show. The next morning, Ben asked me why the back door was unlocked. "I must have forgotten," I said quickly, my voice too casual, too rehearsed. He didn't press further, but his gaze lingered on me for a moment longer than usual, and I felt the first tremor of unease. As the days went on, the guilt began to creep in, slipping through the cracks of my resolve like water through a sieve. Every time I looked at Ben, I felt the weight of my betrayal pressing down on me. But even that wasn't enough to stop me. Ryan and I found ways to see each other, quick, stolen moments in the afternoons when Ben was at work. Every meeting was more reckless than the last, and with every risk, the stakes grew higher. One evening, as I stood in the kitchen preparing dinner, my phone buzzed on the counter. A message from Ryan. "Ryan, I can't stop thinking about you." I quickly swiped it away as Ben walked in, but the flicker of suspicion in his eyes told me he'd seen enough. "Who was that?" he asked, his tone casual but probing. "Just a friend," I lied, my heart hammering in my chest. He didn't say anything, but the tension in the room was palpable. That night, as I lay in bed beside him, I felt the weight of everything I'd been hiding, the lies, the secrets, the tangled web I'd woven. I knew it was only a matter of time before it all unraveled. And when it did, I wasn't sure what would be left standing. The unraveling came quicker than I expected. It wasn't a gradual slip or a slow erosion of the facade I'd built. It was an explosion, sudden and catastrophic, shattering everything I thought I'd carefully hidden. It started with Ben's silence. At first, I told myself I was imagining it. He was tired from work, distracted by emails, too busy to notice the strain in my voice or the slight tremor in my hands. But over the next few days, it became impossible to ignore. His questions were sharper, his gaze lingered too long, and there was a stiffness to his tone that made my chest tighten. "Who were you talking to the other night?" he asked at dinner, his fork hovering over his plate. "No one," I said quickly, too quickly. "Don't lie to me, Olivia," he said, his voice low, calm, and far more dangerous for it. The words froze in my throat. He didn't need to say it outright, I knew. He knew. That night, I barely slept. I lay awake staring at the ceiling, my heart pounding as I tried to piece together a plan. Should I confess? Deny everything? Run? But I didn't have to make the choice. The next afternoon, I was outside watering the garden when Ben came home early. I hadn't even heard his car pull into the driveway, and when I turned, there he was, standing at the edge of the yard, his face a mask of restrained fury. "Ryan's truck is parked down the street," he said, his voice tight. "Care to explain why?" The blood drained from my face.
Ben E.
He didn't let me finish. You think I don't know? He snapped, stepping closer. You think I haven't noticed the late nights, the way you've been avoiding me? You think I don't see the way he looks at you? I opened my mouth to deny it, but the words wouldn't come. The truth hung in the air between us, unspoken but undeniable. How long? He demanded, his voice breaking. I hesitated, my chest heaving as I tried to find the words. A few weeks, I admitted finally, my voice barely above a whisper. Ben stared at me, his expression shifting from anger to something far worse, disappointment. I trusted you, he said, his voice hollow. I trusted you, Olivia. Tears blurred my vision as I reached for him, but he stepped back, shaking his head. Don't, he said. Don't touch me. The sound of a car engine broke the tension, and I turned to see Ryan pulling into the driveway. My stomach dropped. Ben's eyes narrowed, and without another word, he marched toward the truck. Ryan barely had time to climb out before Ben was in his face. Get out of here, Ben growled, his fists clenched. Now. Ryan glanced at me, his expression torn, but he didn't argue. He got back into the truck and drove away, leaving me alone with the wreckage of what we'd done. Ben didn't come back inside. He grabbed his keys and left, slamming the door behind him. The silence that followed was deafening, a suffocating weight pressing down on me. For days, I didn't hear from him. He didn't answer my calls or texts, and every passing hour felt like another piece of my life slipping away. Ryan tried to reach out, but I couldn't bring myself to respond. Whatever we'd had, whatever fleeting connection had burned so brightly, it wasn't worth the destruction it had caused. Finally, on the third day, Ben came home. He didn't say anything at first, just stood in the doorway, looking at me with an expression I couldn't decipher. I'm staying at a hotel, he said finally. I need time to think. Ben, please, I begged, my voice cracking. We can fix this. He shook his head, his eyes filled with a sadness that cut deeper than any anger ever could. I don't know if we can, Olivia. And then he was gone again, leaving me alone in the house that suddenly felt too big, too empty. Weeks passed, and though the silence between Ben and me lingered, the rest of the world moved on. The neighbors whispered behind closed doors, and Ryan disappeared from the neighborhood entirely. I spent my days in the garden, pulling weeds and pruning bushes, as if I could somehow trim away the mess I'd made of my life. But no matter how hard I worked, the cracks remained. Ben eventually came back, but things were different. The distance between us was a chasm, and neither of us knew how to bridge it. We tried counseling, awkward date nights, but the ghost of what I'd done haunted every conversation, every touch. In the quiet moments, when I was alone with my thoughts, I found myself replaying everything, not just the affair, but the years that led to it. The loneliness, the resentment, the quiet erosion of a marriage that once felt unshakable. I didn't blame Ryan, not really. He was just a symptom of something much deeper, a mirror reflecting all the things I'd been too afraid to face. And so, I started the slow, painful work of rebuilding, not just my marriage, but myself. Because at the end of it all, I realized that the emptiness I'd been trying to fill wasn't about Ben, or Ryan, or anyone else. It was about me, and healing that would take far more than stolen kisses and whispered promises. It would take time.